Shaun Haney here with realagriculture.com and RealAg Radio, Rural Radio 147, Sirius XM. Well, it is the 1-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Some things have changed, some things haven't, and there is a lot of geopolitical issues that go around this one. And it does impact a lot of Canadian farmers as well, as we've seen real disruption in the supply chain, as well as the distribution of grain around the world. We're going to hit this from the geopolitical front here today. We've got Jacob Shapiro. He is with Cognitive Investments. Jacob, welcome.
Nice to be here with you, Shaun. I'm enjoying my first cup of coffee with you in the morning on this call here. So if I get more animated as the interview goes on, that's why. Yeah,
well, you and I both. Okay, so we're 12 months into this, and it's, I guess I personally, I followed this from, I guess you could say afar. You're somebody that's in this very, very much as a part of what you do for a living. As you look back at the last 12 months, what has changed in terms of this war? Because a lot of times we talk about the Ukraine war, and it's like this static thing. It's a little bit out of the mainstream, so it's been a bit hard to follow for people back here in Canada and the U.S. So from your perspective, what has changed over the last 12 months?
Well, first of all, I think you put your finger on the pulse of what Zelensky and what all of Ukraine is worried about, because the more it becomes just a boring, static conflict that is constantly in the background, the more support is going to wane for, military aid and ammunition, all these things that the Ukrainians need in order to defend their country. So in some ways, Ukraine is trying to make sure that you don't forget it. Zelensky is running around to different capitals and doing all these things, and he's a seasoned media personality because he wants you not to forget. I think it still is yet to be determined what has changed so much. I think based on what's happened so far, I don't think Europe is ever going to trust Russia, at least not in its current iteration. As long as Vladimir Putin is president of Russia, as long as this regime is in control of Russia, I think that the Europeans will fundamentally mistrust Russia. So instead of getting cheap energy from Russia, instead of thinking of Russia as a place where you could export goods to eventually, or maybe even hire workers to be part of that Eastern European supply chain, I think Europe has pretty clearly realized, okay, that's not going to work. And the flip side of that is that the European Union becomes this more geopolitical actor. It starts thinking in terms of, supply chain self-sufficiency and digital sovereignty and all these buzzwords that they're throwing around and having meetings about. So I think that's one way to think about it. The second is just, and I said this when the war started, and I still think it's true. Vladimir Putin has transformed Russia from a great power into a Chinese gas station. The only real future for Russia is as a supplier of commodities, not just to China, but countries that either can't or are willing to look the other way at what Russia's doing on the ground in Ukraine. So if you're Brazil and you need fertilizer from Russia, you don't have the luxury of political principles. You have to do whatever you have to do to secure the fertilizer. If you're China, this is great news. Suddenly you have a great cheap depot for all the things that you were dependent in some ways on different parts of the world for, that is right next to your border. So that, I think, is also a fundamental change.
What are both sides looking for at this point to, I guess, claim victory? That the common question that gets thrown out when I hear interviews about this is, how does this end? But that's a very, very complicated question. What is Ukraine striving for, and what is Russia striving for?
So Ukraine is the easier answer to that question. Ukraine, and Zelensky in particular, have been very clear about what they want. They want all of their land back, and they don't want just the land back that started with the war last year. They want to go back to the 2014 Russian seizure of Crimea and parts of the Donbass. They want all of that back, and they're saying they're not going to rest until they get all of it back. That's the reason, by the way, that they want tanks and why they want fighter jets and all of these offensive military capabilities. That's not Ukraine saying that they need those things to defend themselves. The HIMARS and all these, sort of defensive weapons that the United States and other Western countries are providing Ukraine, they do pretty well on the defensive. But what Ukraine really wants is to break the Russian military, to show the Russian military that it can't push Ukraine around and take back all that land that was sovereign Ukrainian land. The riddle here is, what does Russia want, and what would Russia consider victory? And Russia has been a riddle since the whole beginning of this. If I had been on your show last year, I would have been here pontificating about how Russia was never going to invade Ukraine, and I would have looked really stupid. So I'm glad I met you in the last 12 months and not in the last 24 months. Putin gave his sort of State of the Kremlin address this week I forget which Russian assembly it was. It doesn't really matter. He was speaking to the Russian people, and he was sort of vague. I mean, he sort of rejected the idea that Ukraine even exists. He said he was suspending the New START arms agreement with the United States. I mean, it was kind of a rambling speech that was all over the place, but it didn't sound like somebody who was about to give up. Or who thought that this war was going to be over anytime soon. Now, the one thing I'll say about Russia is I pay less attention now to what Putin and all these lackeys say and more what they do. And on the ground, it seems like they're trying to conquer the Donbass. It doesn't look like the way they're deploying troops right now and things like that means they are considering going for, say, Odessa, or trying again to take Kiev in sort of a political decapitation strike, even getting to Moldova in a really ambitious rendering, which is what they tried to do at the outset of the war. Maybe in the long term, that's what they want. Maybe they think they have to capture the Donbass first and then lick their wounds, and then maybe they can move on. But it seems to me right now, with what they've mobilized, with what they're doing on the ground, it looks like if they can take the Donbass, they might say, okay, like at least this stage of the conflict is over, and we feel good about where we're at. But again, we're just sort of flipping coins into a well there. It's very unclear to me what Russia's end goals are and whether it thinks those end goals are realistic even.
You mentioned the address from Vladimir Putin. What about the address from President Biden? He made a surprise visit to the region at the beginning of the week. I think he also spoke in Poland, I believe. Was there any messaging there that you took from it?
I mean, that was an incredibly important symbolic gesture. So I didn't know this at the time, but when I looked it up, I mean, that's the first visit from a sitting U.S. president to Ukraine since George Bush. So it's been quite a while since the United States president came and showed up. And Biden's rhetoric was fairly defiant and fairly fiery. It was basically, we're not going to give up on Ukraine. Ukraine is this bastion of democracy. Ukraine stands, all these other things. You have to juxtapose that, though, with what's actually going on. So last week, the White House was leaking to Reuters and Bloomberg and any other media publication that would share it that U.S. support for Ukraine was not indefinite, and that the United States was not going to continue just sending aid willy-nilly to Ukraine all the time. And if you look at polls in the United States, it's gone from something like 60% to 50% in terms of, do we approve of support of Ukraine? And it's even lower when you talk about, actual economic aid. United States citizens seem cooler with sending them ammunition and weapons and things like that. But when you start adding up all the billions that the Biden administration wants to send over to Ukraine, you're starting to get some pushback. Especially from the Republican Party, which we're coming up on an election cycle. Like all these things are going to be there. So yeah. I think it was very notable that Biden was there. That's like the maximum amount of symbolic power that he can deploy. He was trying to do everything he could to show that he is committed to this, and that if it were up to him, it wouldn't be a question. But back home, I mean, that's a tougher story to sell for Biden. So it's a big deal, but it's not determinative.
Yeah, even in Canada, where there is a substantial Ukrainian population, even in Canada, the support is I guess waning. I'm not sure how to best describe that, but the numbers are so 12 months ago, 83% of Canadians supported Ukraine winning the war. It's now down to 71. Stronger support in Western Canada. That Saskatchewan is really where there is a large population of Ukrainians. So even in a country like Canada, which is really taken, I guess, even from the sanction standpoint, if you look at the sanctions on fertilizer, Canada's out on an island, the only country that is doing some of these things to support or show support for the Ukrainian side. If Zelensky and the Ukrainian people don't have support or from Europe or from the West, with whether it's weapons, artillery, money, they've got a real problem.
Yes, I mean, this is Russia's strategy right now. Russia at first had delusions of grandeur and thought it was just going to waltz into Kyiv and this was going to be a blitzkrieg and everything was going to be fine. That's over. But they haven't given up. They've gotten back off the mat and they're punching again. And the one tried and true tactic of Russian grand strategy going throughout the centuries is they will outlast you. They will out-endure you. They will be willing to take more pain and more punishment and more death than their opponent is going to be. And that's I hate to be so doom and gloom about it, but that appears to me to be what Russia's trying to turn this conflict into. They want to turn it into a meat grinder that they know they're going to stick with for years if that's what's necessary. That's what Putin was saying. Zelensky really here has a race against time. He's not in a position yet to launch an offensive against Russian troops. That would be a very risky thing to do. But if he doesn't do that, if he doesn't show that Ukraine still has the momentum, if he can't somehow create a new groundswell of support in the West, suddenly people are going to be looking at Ukraine and not saying, here's as many weapons, here's a blank check for what you need, but hey, you need to make peace with these guys. Hey, we need to figure out some way to deal with Putin. What parts of your territory are you willing to give up so that the world can go back to normal? And that's a really difficult position for Ukraine. I think in an ideal world, Ukraine would just want to sit there, kill a bunch of these Russian offensives, soak up all these different weapons and ammunition and military capabilities and teach Ukrainians how to use them, and then maybe try and gear up for an offensive even next year. But I don't think they have that kind of time. As those poll numbers showed in Canada and as the poll numbers in the United States show, Ukraine also has to win the battle for hearts and minds in the West, because you're absolutely right. They're out of ammunition. They cannot make their own ammunition. They're dependent on the West for these things. And that qualitative advantage in terms of ammunition and some of those capabilities and technology is part of what's allowing them to succeed on the battlefield. If you took that away, suddenly this conflict starts to look very scary very quickly.
Yeah. And what I wonder is, do we see a change in some of the messaging from President Zelensky? So, currently right now, it seems to me, and you correct me if I'm wrong, very like, please help the Ukrainian people to fight Russia. Do we start to hear more here going forward if we do see the support slipping, more of the story about, okay, if you don't support us, here's the outcome that you're going to have to deal with, that there's unintended consequences of not supporting Ukraine. Could we hear more of that going forward?
Zelensky was a comic, and a fairly good one at that, in Ukraine, and has a whole media background. I think he's a little more savvy than that, because a positive argument is always going to be more powerful than a negative argument. I think you've already seen him switch messaging, though. And you see this with what he's been focusing on at home right now. It's about corruption. He's firing ministers for, hiking up prices for basic foodstuffs or sort of things that the military needed. He's going through all these some who used to be supporters of him, and investigating them for corruption or trying to figure out ways to clean up Ukraine's political system. And that's a clear message to the West. It's him telegraphing to the West, hey, this money is not being wasted. We're not just here, splitting up this big pot of cash that you sent to us with all these Ukrainian oligarchs and this Ukrainian political system that you have no visibility into. I want you to have visibility. I want to become part of the European Union. I want to become this democratic state that is worthy of inclusion in NATO and all these other things. So I think you've already seen that shift in messaging, and he has to convince the United States and Western Europe and European Union, Germany, and all these countries that money that's going to go there is not going to be wasted. One of the reasons Ukraine is in the position that it is in is because we're all lionizing Ukraine's defense of their homeland because it's incredibly inspiring. But if you look at sort of coverage of Ukraine in the years up to the war, it was all about corruption. It was all about a morass of political cronyism that couldn't make use of IMF funds, and a lack of visibility into what was going on in the political system itself, in some ways mirrored parts of the corrupt Russian political system. So I think you've already seen that shift in messaging. What I worry about is that, and you can probably see behind me, there's a bunch of Civil War books. I'm a Civil War nerd. I've been thinking about Robert E. Lee and the Confederacy lately, and about how they had to make that push up to Gettysburg to try and show the rest of the world that they could beat the Union, like on Union territory, and maybe that would lead to diplomatic or political help. It's not at all the same situation. I'm not saying Robert E. Lee is Zelensky, but the thing that I worry about is Ukraine feeling like it has to show not just transparency from an economic perspective, but also that beating Russia is a realistic thing and that it could happen in a fairly short time horizon. Because if you're going to the United States or to Germany and saying, hey, we just need tanks for the next 5 years, like, they're not going to give them to you. You have to show them somehow that there is a realistic path from point A to point B where the conflict ends and where you get Crimea back and all these other areas back. But maybe he will switch to the messaging you're talking about. But if he switched to that messaging, I think I would actually probably get pretty pessimistic. That would probably be the last ditch effort.
Interesting perspective. Okay, so Russia has a population, simple Google searches here. Russia has a population of 143 million, Ukraine 44 million. There's a people problem. At some point, do we see the potential for NATO troops to participate, or is that really off the table at this point?
I mean, that's possible, but then we're, slowly stalking towards World War III. NATO's been very fastidious about not getting involved. They don't want to get involved. I'm not sure Russia wants them involved. If NATO got involved in force, I mean, Russia's not going to be able to compete there. You're right to point out that numerically Russia has the numbers, and that's why the longer this conflict goes on, probably the more the balance of scales tips towards Russia. The flip side, again, is that Russia's waging an offensive war across an incredibly flat plain, and it's a huge front. The whole reason that Russia's doing this is because it feels insecure because of those large plains and massive fronts that it has to deal with, and it wants to push out to the Carpathian Mountains, which is where the border of Ukraine sort of terminates, so that they have somewhat of a defensible position. So in some sense, it doesn't matter that they have a numerical advantage because they're pushing over an absolutely huge area of land that's very difficult to supply. The logistics and the supply chains, they've already seen how difficult it was to do that into Ukraine. The problem, again, for Ukraine is the flip side is also true. So if Ukraine is going to punch back, well, now you're going over the flat plain in the opposite direction. You're going to need logistics. You're going to need supply chains. This is not just about moving defenders from one point to another point or making sure that your defensive weaponry or ammunition is in the right place. You're right to point out that the numerical advantage favors Russia sort of in the long term, but just the nature of this conflict means that if Russia really does want to push, say, all the way to the Carpathians, I mean, it's going to need either to improve the casualty rates that it's getting because the Ukrainians are inflicting massive casualties for the Russians as they push through, or something else is going to have to change.
We know how the Ukrainian people feel about this war. I think that's pretty clear. How do the Russian people feel about it? What have you been hearing from people on the ground there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can tell you that, the few Russian analyst friends that I have that I continue to talk to, they all told me that Russia wasn't going to invade Ukraine, and I listened to them. Some of them have gone silent, and to the extent that I'm still in touch with others of them, they're parroting the rhetoric of the Russian regime. That makes sense. I think Russia's become, I mean, it was already an authoritarian regime, but I think it's become a much more controlled regime, especially from a media perspective. What Russian opposition papers that were out there that I used to read, most of them have been shut down or subject to sanctions and things like that. You also saw a lot of Russians making their feelings felt with their feet, with their movements. I mean, we saw a pretty large exodus of Russian nationals from the country, whether to Central Asia, whether to the Caucasus, whether to Eastern Europe, in the months immediately after the war started, and especially when the Russian government announced a larger military mobilization. My sense is that, the charitable interpretation is that people are against it, but they don't feel like they can challenge the Russian government, so they're just going to bide their time. The less charitable interpretation is that they're simply apathetic, or that the Russians that are left are buying the propaganda, and they think this is a war for the Russian motherland and for the glory of Russia and for Russia's status as a great power. What we can say is that there have been, there were some protests in Russia at the start of the war, but there have been no mass protests in Russia against the war. Nobody seems to be coming for Putin with a knife in the back to try and change the regime, and there doesn't seem to be any kind of groundswell of political discontent that Putin is afraid of. He's out there, giving his speeches and sounding and looking fairly confident that he's in control of things. So I don't think I'm in a position to say that the average Russian person supports the war. They probably don't, but for whatever reason, they can't say that, and they're not expressing that politically. It seems pretty clear that Putin and his cronies are still in charge, and that's all that really matters.
Yeah, if anybody thought that, forcing the sale of Chelsea Football Club and seizing some yachts, that tactic doesn't appear to have changed, at least on the surface from 100,000 feet. I obviously don't know what's happening.
I had a Russian analyst on my podcast a month or two after the invasion, and I remember him saying, "So we can't have French wine. So what? You think we care? This is a fight for the sort of future of Russia." I'm reminded also of a month before the invasion, I believe it was the Russian ambassador to Sweden. I'm pretty sure that that's right. It was one of those countries. Was asked, what, do sanctions deter Russia against pursuing future military action? And I'm quoting him here, so you can pardon his French, not mine. He literally said to the reporter, "We don't give a fuck about sanctions." Like, that's the way the Russian sort of political class thinks about it. And that's what I mean about that tried and true tactic of Russian endurance. Like, they will put up with more. This is more important to them. They will suffer more than even the inconvenience that the Europeans are willing to suffer. Now, I think Moscow has been surprised at the amount of suffering that Europe was willing to sign up for, but Europe also never really felt the suffering. The gas crisis didn't emerge.
Right.
There was
the warm winter.
So like Europe really hasn't suffered. And like now you're going to tell them, oh, but this Ukraine thing is still going on. And now you have to worry about it for another winter. Like that's the thing I think Russia's playing for and the thing they have going in their favor.
We're just trying to fit into this. That that seems to be, I don't know, is that the kind of the wild card in this conflict, or what game is she playing?
That's funny. I don't think of China as a wild card at all. In some ways, I find China to be the most predictable player on the global stage right now. Now, that doesn't mean it's a stabilizing player. There's a lot of volatility in China, but I don't feel that China's intentions are really confusing or secret in any meaningful way. Look, China. I don't think that China would have been for this if Russia even told them what was going on. On the flip side, China really doesn't want to see the collapse of Russia. China really likes the idea of there being multiple powers out there that the United States has to deal with. It doesn't want to be the one power that the United States has to focus on as a strategic rival. So if Russia fell apart or became a liberal democracy or joined the European Union in some sort of, platonic ideal of a better universe, then China's all by itself. And the United States can just focus on China. All those weapons and things like that are going to Ukraine. They can go straight to Taiwan. So I think there is interest for China in making sure that Russia doesn't collapse. That's not really in their interests. The other part of this is that the United States for years, and this is both the Trump administration and the Biden administration, so there's nothing partisan here. If you look back at the national security strategies for both administrations, it's very clear. They describe Russia and China as peer competitors. And when you treat Russia and China that way, in some ways, you're forcing them to be friendly with each other. There's not a lot of love lost between Russia and China. These countries fought a border skirmish in the 1960s. Parts of Eastern Russia were lands that were Chinese that Russia seized from China in the late 1800s. It's not just the British that took Hong Kong. Vladivostok used to be a Chinese city. That's the main port of the Russians in the Pacific. So China certainly has historical memory there, but for as long as the United States is going to say, okay, it's China 1A and Russia 1B, China doesn't really have a choice. It's going to have some kind of relationship with Russia. And from China's perspective, they need the oil, they need natural gas, they need agricultural commodities, and they need all these things that Russia has. So there's a bit of an alliance of convenience there. I would not make the mistake, though, of listening to all the flowery language and the, Xi and Putin and no limits to the partnership and things like that. That I don't think is exactly true. China is very pragmatic. If China had a better offer on the table, China might be willing to change its mind. The problem is that the West is just not willing to stomach what it would take to flip China. Now, this is not, I'm not saying whether this is right or wrong, but just to give you an example, if the United States was willing to put support for Taiwan on the table and saying, hey, we might change our policy on Taiwan if you are willing to flip your policy on this Russia war, I think you would have Beijing's attention. But the sort of compromises that would be necessary to peel China away from Russia, given everything that's happened right now, I don't think that the West can or will stomach those things, at least not until this conflict gets much, much worse.
So is China currently supporting Russia financially? I know there was stuff in the news about, sort of a warning from the U.S. in terms of weapons and things like that. What is actually happening right now? Nothing or a lot?
China is buying Russian commodities, and Russia needs that because Europe is trying not to buy Russian commodities. So in that sense, China is propping up the Russian economy. If you could get China and India to sign on to all the Western sanctions that have been imposed on Russia, the Russian economy would probably collapse in a period of weeks, if not months. They just don't have the markets if you're able to take China and India off the board. The United States warned China about supplying Russia with weapons. I have seen no evidence to show that China has supplied weapons to Russia, and I would honestly be surprised if it did. I think China understands that that would be a red line for the United States, and that the trade war, which is already hurting China in myriad ways, would get a heck of a lot worse if it provided weapons to Russia. And what ostensible gain China would get from that is not clear to me. It's not good for China if Russia conquers Ukraine or ends this war easily. All the distraction is great for China right now. Like, pay attention to this other thing while we're trying to do our things at home. So crazier things have happened. Russia invaded Ukraine, but I don't see the strategic logic of China providing weapons. And I think the United States just telegraphed to you, that's the red line there. So you can buy your commodities from Russia. We're not going to sanction you any more than we're going to sanction a country like India for that. But if you go past this line, then you will, suffer certain consequences.
Besides the terrifying reality, this all sounds very close to Ken Follett's most recent novel, about a misunderstanding and small events leading to the escalation of World War III. This is a massive geopolitical puzzle that we have not seen for a very long time. Is that correct?
Yes. Well, there's also different opinions about this and scenarios out there and models that you can talk about. So with most, presentations and things that I do right now, I've been talking about a multipolar world. So I see a world in which there isn't a dominant power, that there aren't even two dominant powers, where you have Russia and China and India and Brazil and the United States, all these different powers asserting their own interests and looking out for themselves. There's a version of the world, though, that goes bipolar again, where it's the United States versus China, and everybody sort of gets up on one side. And if China and Russia collapse in on themselves, suddenly we're in a unipolar moment again. So you're right, though, that I think geopolitics has become operative in a way that it hasn't been for 30 years, because between the collapse of the Soviet Union, and we can debate about whether you date it with Trump's election or the pandemic or Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that period of time geopolitically was relatively stable. The United States was the top military, economic, political power in the world. It really didn't have any rivals, and no one felt comfortable pushing back against that liberal world order. That's changed. And to your point, the riddle or the real question here is, does the United States reassert itself with its allies? Do we get this sort of US-China bifurcated world? Or, as I think, do we get this multipolar environment, which is a lot of volatility and a lot of uncertainty, but I also think a lot of opportunity. I mean, there's a lot of doom and gloom in what we're talking about, and the war is incredibly depressing. But when you look at the last multipolar era from the 1890s, 1900s, there were wars and a lot of terrible things happened, but a lot of good things happened as well. And, not everything in the world is falling apart. Case in point, this is not World War III. This is a war between Russia and Ukraine. Yeah. Nobody else is really, you can throw in Belarus if you want, but that's basically Russia. Nobody else wants to or seems to be getting involved in this conflict anytime soon in terms of boots on the ground, actual fighting. And I have no expectation that it will mushroom in that direction.
Okay, so I'll ask you the question that I mentioned earlier that is the most common one that gets thrown out. How does this end? What ends this?
Analysts like me hate wars because they remove many of the things that allow analysts who rely on fundamental factors to make predictions. So I'm very heavily caveating here because a general could put a missile in the wrong place, and suddenly we could be off to World War III. What if a Russian missile has a terrible failure in its guidance system and hits a neighborhood in Warsaw? Like, that could really change things very meaningfully, and none of the beautiful ideas that I can scope here for you would be able to account for that. So there is, like, the fog of war is real. And once you're in a war, unpredictable things like that can happen. In terms of where we go from here, though, there's a lot of uncertainty. I don't have really good answers for where I think we're going to go from here. I made the mistake last year of having some certainty that Russia wasn't going to invade, and I really can't make that mistake again. What I can tell you is that it doesn't look like it's going well for the Russian military, and that I think that as long as Ukraine can maintain enough Western support for another 12 to 18 months at the current levels, they should be able to ward off any of these Russian attacks, and they should be able to maybe even push back a little bit. So I think eventually, I think things are still in Ukraine's favor here, but they do have to continue ensuring political support from the West, and I don't think Russia's just going to roll over. There is this play for sort of, can you get back to a frozen conflict? Can you get some kind of recognition that, okay, Ukraine, you're not going to get Crimea back. You're not going to get this part of Donetsk, which is majority Russian anyway, back. Is there some way, like, if you're welcomed into NATO, is that enough of a security guarantee to let you give back some of that land? So, but yeah, I'm rambling here and dancing around your question because I don't really know where it goes from here. I don't think we can think in terms of 2 or 3 or 5 years. There's an active war right now, and the only things I can tell you is that the center of gravity is, can Ukraine maintain political support and military support and economic support from the West? And is Russia willing to take the casualties in this meat grinder conflict moving forward? Right now, both sides are locked in place and they're moving that direction, and it's a contest for who's gonna wage out. I think if you put a gun to my head, I'd say I think Ukraine eventually is going to push the Russians back, but that's probably my biases because I don't want to live in a world where Russia wins this one. So,
final question: as an analyst, your career has been in the geopolitical world. What's been the most difficult thing about trying to get your head wrapped around this puzzle or the learnings from this past 12 months of this Ukraine war?
Well, the most difficult thing in all of political analysis is to recognize that you're wrong and to very quickly pivot into understanding something just as deeply, even though you were wrong. So, I said that I got the Russian invasion of Ukraine wrong. I did, but I'm actually proud of getting it wrong because at Cognitive, we had a position in Russian equities at the time, which was built around the idea that the market was sort of overhyping the risk of a Russian invasion. We thought there was some interesting risk return on Russian assets. The moment that Putin gave his first speech to his National Security Council saying that he was going to start a military operation in Ukraine, we got out. And I think it was 3 or 4 days later that Russia shut down the stock market, and you couldn't have gotten out even if you tried. So we took a loss on that, and it was an analytical mistake on my part, but we were willing to change our minds quickly, and we immediately pivoted towards trying to understand what this new world was. The hardest thing in political analysis is getting rid of the past, just because something happened one way before doesn't mean it's going to happen again. I think the biggest and the most tangible example of this, which is highly critical to Canadian producers and American farmers, is what's going to happen with this Turkey, Ukraine, Russia, Black Sea grain deal. I think people assume just because, there was doom and gloom last year, but everything basically turned out okay. Like Ukrainian exports, I think were down a third or whatever the exact percentage was. But, the grain deal eventually got into place and ships started moving and everything started going okay. I think people are assuming that's going to happen again. What if it doesn't? What if Russia doubles down and says, we're not extending the grain deal? What if the fighting starts to get in the way of Ukrainian farmers actually being able to plant or get their crops from point A to point B? So I think that there's a complacency also in the fact that the last 12 months didn't go as bad. It wasn't the worst case scenario that a lot of people were describing, and worst case scenarios are still on the table there. And so you have to operate in a world and see, okay, here are all the things that are happening. Here are all the things that are possible, and still maintain your sanity. It was F. Scott Fitzgerald that said the true sign of intelligence is being able to hold two contradictory ideas in your mind at the same time. That's what you have to do right now. You sort of have to deal with okay, here's the stalemate, here's the fog of war, here's what everyone's saying, here's all the bad stuff that could potentially happen. What do? I can't just go into a fetal position and not make any decisions. I have to make decisions, but hedge my bets and kind of move forward. That's the really difficult part about geopolitics, because we can talk about strategy and politics until the cows come home. It's really about, okay, now it's time to price our wheat for the season, or now it's time to think about like what is coming out of the Black Sea, and you really have to make decisions. And there, it's really just about imagine all the scenarios. Don't think for a second that you're going to be right. Just try to be more prepared for whatever scenario comes up, so that when something goes wrong, you know how to pivot very quickly.
Great advice. And we've got part of our special coverage of the 1-year anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We've got an interview on realagriculture.com with Arlen Suderman of StoneX, breaking down, kind of looking at the grain markets and what we can think about going forward here, talking about just sort of building off of what Jacob just said. Hey, Jacob, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Great analysis, great perspective. Always enjoy our chats and look forward to the next one.
Yeah, I hope we're back here in a year to discuss the end of the Russia-Ukraine war and not the second year of the conflict.
Me too. Okay, well, cheers, bud. Thanks.
Cheers.